This is Theology Bits with Pastor Ben, a ministry of Central Lutheran Church, Eugene, Oregon. This week, we continue our ongoing series of continuity and change in the Old Testament. And believe it or not, we're all the way up here to number 14. And we're closing in on the end of this series. We're going to have this one and two more. But this is, remember, the whole idea of this is how radically different things become over time in a religious movement, beginning all the way back in Genesis, and now we're here with the return. From last time, we talked about in 586 BCE, they went into exile. And they go into exile into Babylon. They're no longer the nation that they were. And last time we had a focus on Ezekiel, where it's how do they live in exile? Well, here, now, something changes in 539 BCE. There was something called the Edict of Cyrus. Now, Cyrus was a Persian ruler, and Persia had conquered Babylon, and Babylon was the superpower, if you recall, that had hauled them off into exile. And unrelated to anything dealing with Israel, Persia conquers Babylon, and their ruler, Cyrus, allows, in the Edict of Cyrus, all of the people enslaved by the Babylonians to go home. And it wasn't, and we actually know about this from secondary sources. There's a famous Cyrus, it's called the Cyrus cylinder, that describes this thing, and it does mention that those in Yehuda, a new phrase that's used in the Persian language, those people are allowed to return back. And so the people do return back, but they don't go back and establish a new nation. They are now a client kingdom. The land of Israel is now owned by the Persians, and they are allowed to live there. So they are not a nation, they have no ruler, they have a governor. The governor, and by the way, the chief priest, are both approved by the Persians. So that's who they are. But there's a challenge, because while they're allowed to return, and many do not. Many stay and establish what we call the diaspora. That is, the people of Israel are dispersed, you see that word from that Greek word diaspora, all throughout the world and are no longer in one place. Now, those who do return are now in the place, and we'll be looking at how their theology changes and who they are changes when they return. Those who do come back, but they know they are not the whole people. Only some people return. Even more troubling, when they get there, not only do only some people return, but there are others living there. And so what we discover is they have a new crisis to deal with that they never really had to deal with before. Of who are we compared to all of these others? Are we the same, those who came back to the land? Are they the same as those who did not? Are they in relationship with those other people living there? Or are they totally different? How are they going to relate moving forward? Are they going to be neighborly? Are they going to be adversarial? How is this going to work? They have to ask that question. And much of the theology in this time period is addressing that question. We're going to see some disparities. This week is about Ezra and Nehemiah. Next week, we're going to talk about a few different opinions on this topic. But in Ezra and Nehemiah, which is really one book, we break it into two because it gets too long. Nehemiah being the governor, Ezra being the priest. And they return back, and they have to figure out who they are. They go to Jerusalem. They do not try to establish a new temple, not in this book. That's more than what they're trying to establish. They're trying to go repopulate Jerusalem. But again, there's these other people living all around. And what's more about these other people is some of them, at least, are following the religion that they thought was exclusively theirs. There is religious practice happening that looked rather similar. This is the first time when the language of Samaritan might be useful to use. People living in the land practicing a religion very similar, but not quite the same. Well, they have several issues. One is not everybody's there. And so, what does Ezra do? The priest, he does something completely new. He gets up, stands before the assembly, and reads Torah. Reads the Torah scroll. Now, this would not seem very shocking to any of you who are part of modern religious traditions where everything is about reading scripture. But here, the idea of public reading as a worship practice that gathers people together is relatively new. And of course, there's an obvious reason for this. There is one temple, but where, and you have to be in Jerusalem to go there, and it's, by the way, it's destroyed anyway, but where is the Torah? Well, there's just as many copies as you care to make. There can be a copy of Torah in Jerusalem, and one in diaspora, and one elsewhere, and elsewhere, and elsewhere. And all can come together and read it. The idea of study being a very central part of worship is something that is pretty new in this area. Very far cry from, remember, Abraham, which was this family unit who everything was about going to a new land and offering sacrifices. Here, it is how the Torah gathers us in and makes us a people. A completely new strategy. We also look at something else that we haven't seen before. That is, we search for a genealogy. Some of you are familiar with genealogies, it's kind of valuable to you. But this is the first time they really look at it, saying, who are we? And most of us who are familiar with Judaism in the modern world will be somewhat familiar with at least the concept of genealogy. You can't just say that you're a member of this group. You gotta make some obvious claim to this. Most of the time, those who are in it it's not in dispute by any means, but you can't just say you're part of this. It's a closed group. Well, that's what we have here, which is, well, you can't just say that you're an Israelite, especially all these people who were living there at the time. You got to make some claim to it. Not only for those of you who think you're priests, which remember, only those who were born priests, that is in the tribe of Levi or a descendant of Aaron, could be a priest, but also simply being a member of Israel. Are you included or not? Now, many would point out the whole point of a genealogy, a written genealogy, is to include people who you would have thought weren't included. Turned out you were related this whole time, but you didn't know. But it's a completely new question based on who are we compared to everyone else. And also, by the way, genealogies apply to people who don't return. They do come to Jerusalem, and they work very hard to build walls around it. But it's very different between what the walls were for. They're not really for military defense. They're for dividing us and them. Who are we? If we want to know who we are, we have to know who we're not. And while that sounds harsh maybe to us, it is a practical reality. For it to mean something, to be part of this group, it has to be about something, and not just anybody can join it, or else why bother? And they focus here on Torah, here on genealogy, and they recognize that this will exclude some people who may want to be included. It's not as if there's absolutely no way to be included if you weren't part of it already, but they are more worried about answering this question, who are we? By the way, many people say at this time, with the return is the first time it might be appropriate to start using this word. Meaning, before this, if you were a citizen of Israel, you simply were part of the group. You were an Israelite. Before that, if you were in the family of Abraham, you were simply part of this group. Now, well, it's not so simple. Who's in? Who's out? Well, it's not about citizenship. They're not citizens anyway. Remember, this is a client kingdom. And it's not just about religious practice, because after all, some other people are practicing this religion. And they don't say they have to stop practicing the religion. You just can't say you're the same as we are. And then it does get to one thing which sounds more aggressive, which is Ezra says he does not like that some people in this group have been marrying local people and families have become mixed, and he doesn't want this. He wants to drive out all these foreign wives. Now that is something that's just a little bit harsh for us, especially those of us from the New Testament era who, or whose theology is built on the New Testament, which is all about including Gentiles rather than excluding them. But we're going to find out next week these were not the only opinion, and we're going to look at Ruth and Jonah and to see different perspectives. But here what I want to present is completely new way of being religious based on a new question. Who are we? And that question is going to be answered in different ways as we move forward, but it frames this in completely new structures than would have been thought of before, leading to new theology. This has been Theology Bits. I'm Pastor Ben.